Let's go to the next slide, please. So our goals for tonight, our three main goals are to inform you, to share input, and receive questions and introduce the balancing act tool. Next slide, please. Let's skip over this one. This is this is the design review board. So to start out with, just a quick overview of a housing element. It is part of the general plan, and it is updated every year, every 8 years. Luckily, it's not every year. Every 8 years, it's different than the other parts of the county's general plan or countywide plan because it requires it needs to be reviewed and certified by the state Housing and Community Development Agency. And the housing element is a plan to meet our housing needs at every income level. Next slide, please. And you can go to the next slide, please. The number of homes that we plan for in the housing element is driven by what is called the regional housing need allocation. And it is a determination by this, it starts at the state. It's a determination that's based on job growth, population growth, and unmet housing needs. And for the Bay Area, the state has determined that we need to plan for the 9 Bay Area counties need to plan for 441,000 new homes. Of that, the county has about 3% of those homes, or about 14,000 for all of the cities and towns and the unincorporated county together. And the unincorporated county's share, which is what we're here to talk about tonight, is about 3,500 new homes. Next slide, please. This gives us a little picture about what we have planned for in the past. And you can see that the number that we're talking about tonight is a dramatic increase from what we planned for in our previous housing element cycle, when we had 185. Before that, we had 773. And you can see that our cycles have increased pretty dramatically. And to note that this is going to be a pretty big challenge for the county. And we really are going to have to do some significant changes to a number of our policies and programs in order to be able to accommodate this number of new homes. It's also noteworthy that the housing element, primarily the attention is focused on the affordable piece of it, but we are planning for housing at all income levels, from extremely low to above moderate. And they're broken out. These are the percentage of them that are broken out. Next slide, please. Of note, when we're talking about affordable housing in our county, because the income levels are so high, the threshold for qualifying as low income is also very high. So you can be considered low income as a family of 4 making $146,000. And in other parts of the state and the country, that is somebody who would, be well off or moderate income. But in this county, you can be considered low income at 146,000 because our income levels are so high. Next slide, please. When we're talking about who would qualify for in these different income categories, a registered nurse making 150,000, if they had children in that household and were a single parent, they could qualify in that low income category, and they could afford about $3,700 for housing. A firefighter making about 109,000 could afford about 2,700, and that's far below what the median rent price is in the county of a little over 3,200. As you go down the income categories, an elementary school teacher, a starting elementary school or an elementary school teacher making 86,000. It's within that low income category. And then when you get down to the extremely low and the very low income, those are typically people in the service industry, landscapers, childcare workers, other kind of essential workers in our communities. Next slide, please. when you're looking at those, what we're showing here is the gap between housing costs and what some of our local workforce can afford. So a child care worker making $38,000 a year can afford about $1,000 a month for rent when they're paying 30% of their income, which is the guideline that HUD has established. And yet the median income is about 3,200. So there's a significant gap, and you can see these other gaps for a number of our local workforce. Next slide, please. So let me switch gears to talk a little bit about our sites and kind of what the criteria was that we used in selecting sites. So we start by the state reviews our sites that are selected, and they have some really specific criteria, including, is there realistic development potential during the housing element period? So during that 8-year cycle, is the size appropriate for the housing that you're proposing on the site? And is the density adequate, especially for our lower income and affordable sites? Next slide, please. And the state looks at density as a measure of affordability, or as a proxy for affordability. So because of the high cost of land and development in Marin, housing must be built at higher densities in order to be affordable. And housing typically is more affordable as you get more dense. And you can see that typically affordable housing, because of the high cost of land and development, is multifamily housing at a certain density. And we need to show that to the state, that in order for a site to count towards our lower income, it needs to be zoned at a high enough density for that development to development feasibly. And accessory dwelling units, you can see here, are also a choice, and also one of the ways that we can meet our lower income needs or our moderate income needs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Next slide, please. So with this significant challenge that we have in front of us of planning for over 3,500 new homes in the unincorporated county, we went to the board for a joint session with the Board and Planning Commission in December of last year, and they approved the following guiding principles to help us in the site selection process. So looking at, is there a way that we can ensure that there are some housing units in all parts of our county, ensuring county-wide distribution, looking at ways that we can address racial equity and historic patterns of segregation in our community, encouraging infill and redevelopment opportunities within our existing neighborhoods, considering environmental hazards that are identified in our safety element that are a result of climate change, such as flooding, high fire danger, etc. Also leveraging any surplus lands and doing robust community engagement around all of the sites. And so the meeting that we're doing tonight is an example of that. Next slide, please. So to start with the sites inventory, we did an analysis where we started with more sites than we needed, and in some cases more units proposed on each of those sites in order to provide choice and flexibility. And the list that we'll show you later is not a proposed list. It's simply outlining all of the possibilities that we can have that discussion. So we used a variety of strategies as identified here on the slide. We looked at vacant residential sites, approved projects that had not yet been built, accessory dwelling units. We can look at how many we permitted in our last housing element cycle and then project those out for the current housing element cycle. We looked at publicly owned parcels, not dedicated open space, but we did look at other publicly owned parcels. We looked at increasing densities in residential areas to look at that infill opportunity. rezoning commercial sites, mixed use sites at higher densities, religious institutions. So in addition to the uses of those religious institutions, there might be some excess parking areas or underutilized parts of the parcel. And so we looked at housing on some of those sites. Schools, a number of our schools across the county have shrinking enrollment and had an interest in housing for their staff or their workforce. So that is something that we looked at. And then looking at converting existing multifamily to deed restricted affordable. Next slide, please. So the preliminary assessment that we did, in addition to the proposed strategies on sites, we are looking at constraints to development, which may require changes to our countywide plan, including our community plans, because there could be things that are inconsistent with some of the new housing legislation. To start with, we did a comprehensive analysis of the sites. We took into consideration environmental hazards, infrastructure, natural resources, and related factors to help us identify possible new housing opportunities. And sites will be evaluated further in the environmental review document. And you can see by this map that we have sites throughout all areas of the unincorporated county. Next slide, please. The other factor that we have to take into consideration is realistic development capacity. So we can't just look at that a site is zoned for 10 units an acre, for example. We have to look at, typically, is that the density that a site would develop in our community, and take those factors into consideration. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to ask Jillian to share her screen, and we'll take a quick look at some of those candidate sites.
Yes, I will do so.
Just a minute, please.
Okay. Sorry, I had my part of the presentation all queued up here. Okay. Go ahead. Do you want me to zoom into Novato, or?
Yeah, let's just zoom into the county a little bit so that we can see, first of all, that we have sites throughout the county. You can see there's different colors that are associated with which of those categories they met. So if they're school, it's blue. If it's owned by a religious institution, it's that kind of orangey yellow. And there's different colors depending on the type of which of the categories it fits into. Let's just zoom into Novato, starting at the north end of Novato. We have the site that's next to the Buck Center right here. If you want to click on that, the development potential that was studied was up to 66 homes on that site. Is that the right number? I thought it was, oh, sorry.
24 on the other, yeah.
So you're going to have to do that math. So it's about 100 units on those sites. And then let's move over to, let's just kind of go down the freeway over to the Atherton area, I think is the next site that we have right there, that yellow. The Atherton corridor, this was one of the sites that we looked at as far as larger single family lots, and with a potential of rezoning those lots with up to, I think, 100 and, oh, nope, there was more if you want to click on that site again.
They all have different.
Okay. Aline, do you want to just pull up the total, this with the totals, and we could just point those out, because I'm sorry, I don't have that in front of me. So, and this is also all available on the website that we can take a look at. I think that there was a total of about 500 units across all of these areas in the Atherton area. Then there's the Greenpoint Nursery. And this site, the Black Point Family Trust, and there was about 100 units there. So there's some really significant sites in this area that are under consideration. And I think those are all of the sites in the unincorporated part of Novato. Oh no, there's the Bowman Canyon site here. So this is also a large site that some of you might be familiar with. It's over near Stafford Lake. It's an unincorporated part of the county, and it has a development potential that was studied of up to about 300 possible new homes. So let's zoom back out of it. And just to note that these have all been studied as part of our GIS analysis. At this point, none of these sites have been selected. They're just candidate sites, and we'll answer a few more questions later on, but let's go back to the presentation. And we can answer some specific questions in just a moment. So what we have done is, using the guiding principles, we have established 4 different site scenarios where we've combined a number of those different sites. One was ensuring countywide distribution. So in that model, we really tried to make sure that there was an equal distribution in the north part of the county, the west part is the south, and the central part of the county. Another one, we really focused on the racial equity and historic patterns of segregation. So in that scenario, we proposed not having any of our lower income housing in areas that already had a higher concentration of poverty or of a higher percentage of people of color in those neighborhoods. So it was really focusing on having our lower income housing in what the state calls areas of opportunity. The third scenario that we have developed is really focusing on infill and redevelopment. And the fourth scenario was avoiding those environmental hazards associated with climate change. And then the other 2 have been woven throughout all of them. And just to be clear, although each of the scenarios these 4 focused on that one area, we tried to incorporate all of them within each of the scenarios, but one of them was highlighted in each of those. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jillian to talk a little bit more about how we use these in the Balancing Act tool, and then some other ways of providing feedback to our process. And then we'll go to your questions and comments.
Thanks. So we wanted to introduce Balancing Act. It's one of the digital tools we have that we'll use to help us manage all the input we receive. And we use the term Balancing Act quite a bit in our work, since there are so many factors to be balanced and conditions are different throughout the county. We're seeking to hear your feedback about the sites. As Lily said, this is a large list of candidate sites that we have to narrow down, and we want as much public feedback about that as possible. So which sites do you think are well situated? Which ones may not be suitable? What's important that needs to come out of the exercise is, if we choose to reduce density or not build housing in one location, we have to make up that number of units in another location. So this tool does the math, and it can be used to come up with your formula to get us to that RHNA number of 3,569. So I'm going to take you through how to get to Balancing Act. It's through our website. I'll just start sharing my screen. We can provide some links in the chat as well. So if you're on the housing website, these are all of the other ways to provide feedback that I'm happy to go into after I do a little Balancing Act demonstration. So you click on Balancing Act and Housing Sites Feedback, and that takes you to our Balancing Act page, shows our office hours that I'll talk about. If you want to see the full list of candidate housing sites, we have PDFs. We also have the map. But as Lily said, the first thing to do with Balancing Act is really look at the scenarios that she described. So if I'm looking at the scenarios, let's say I think that addressing racial equity and historic patterns of segregation is important. So I click that tool, and then it transports me to the Balancing Act exercise. And these are some really helpful instructions about how to use Balancing Act. So I can just X out of that. And it says that I have a housing plan, because what we did to make this as easy as possible is to pre-populate that 3,569 number with our candidate housing sites. However, you are free to change the densities on all of these sites. So for instance, let's say I don't think that 2754 Novato Boulevard should have as many sites as it does. So as I start to press that red minus button, the units are going down, and you can see on top, I don't have a housing plan anymore because I don't meet that 3,569 units. So I will look elsewhere in the county, and I can use this list, or I can use the map. So I'm going to use the map to say, okay, I actually think that we should have more sites here on Butterfield and Sleepy Hollow. So I just press the plus here until I get back to the housing plan. Another useful widget we have here is this comment button. So I can also just provide a comment to say, this is a great housing site. You can say whatever you want, and we will see these comments based on where they correspond. So this is a really useful tool. You do want to click submit at the bottom so that we get your submissions. We have almost 90 submissions now throughout the county, and almost 4,000 people have visited our Balancing Act sites. So I'm going to go back.
While she's pulling that up, I just would note that the Balancing Act doesn't have every single one of the sites, because we started, as I said, we started with 150 sites, and it's more sites than we need and more units that we need. So we didn't, the tool wasn't able to accommodate all of those sites. So the Balancing Act is really a place where you can kind of think about what those trade-offs are. If we put more housing that is on, we move it out of existing residential neighborhoods, and we need to put more in commercial areas. So it just gives you an idea of what some of those trade-offs are. And then there is another tool that that Jillian will point to you, where you can provide comments on every single one of the sites, including the ones that are not in Balancing Act. So what we've tried to do is just provide a range of tools, like, would you like to comment this way or via email or voicemail or on Balancing Act or on the map? There's just a suite of tools that you can provide comment on. Sorry, go ahead, Jillian.
Yeah, thanks. And the sites that were chosen for Balancing Act are really our larger sites, and that's relative across the county. So now I'm back on our Housing and Safety Elements webpage. If I scroll down, the other tools that we have are the housing sites, suggestions, and feedback. So if I click on that, this is a map where you're actually able to not only comment on all of the sites, but if you found, if there's a site in your neighborhood, or maybe it's on the way to work, something, wow, that would be a really good site for housing, you can actually click. Well, I don't think this is a great example because it's not in unincorporated Marin, but it's still good to see everyone's ideas. So let's go to, let's say, okay, there's another site in Lucas Valley. You can actually just add a pin. So click the plus button, and then you're able, you drag it to the map, and then you release it, and you're able to put a comment there. So we're also collecting comments in that way. Besides email and our phone number, as Lily suggested, we also have the atlas of the candidate sites. So this is also on our website. If you explore this map, it has all of our candidate housing sites. And it also has all of these other layers that you can use to investigate. So say you're in Balancing Act and you take some housing sites out of potentially, let's say, San Rafael or Southern Marin, and you want to put them back, but you don't really know the neighborhood as well in terms of maybe, okay, what's the major infrastructure? So you can click a button and it shows you all of the major infrastructure, the schools. It also can show you the different natural resources in the area. Maybe you want to put housing close to the freeway, away from natural resources potentially. So you can click on all of these layers. And then you can also click on the housing site very far in. And you can also see that there's descriptions of all these layers. And if you click send map comment, you can send a comment about the sites, and we receive those as well. So lots of different ways for us to do this. So I'm going to stop sharing and we can go back to the remainder of the presentation. Thanks, Aline. So lots of fun ways. And then we had all of these opportunities for input. This is our last meeting in the roadshow, but it's not the end of our input. We, like we said, we encourage you to email, call, and use those digital tools in anticipation of our meetings with the joint session of the Board of Supervisors and Planning Commission. If you need help with Balancing Act, we have our last office hours on February 22nd from 5 to 6, and planning staff will be there to help you use Balancing Act if you're having any technical difficulties.
They can also answer any questions about the other tools that Jillian showed you during during those office hours. Great.
So yeah, I'll hand it back to Lily.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of our presentation. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with the questions that have been asked in the chat. Aline will read those out for us. And given the number of people here, I think that that's the most efficient way that we've had. So if you'll just drop your questions and comments into the chat, we will do our best to get through them as quickly as we can. Also, if you just want to leave a comment, though, all of the comments and questions that are in the chat will be downloaded and will be shared. So just to give you a quick overview before Aline starts reading, all of the comments that we collect through this variety of ways that Jillian showed you, as well as the comments and feedback that we get at these community meetings that we're doing, will be summarized and included and presented to the board and the Planning Commission when we meet with them in March. So Aline, if you want to just start reading out the questions, Jillian and I will do our best to answer them.
Yeah, we've got one here. The first one, are the sites that you've identified at Novato for sale by the owner?
The sites, I don't believe that any of the sites are for sale. One of the things to remember about the sites that are selected in the housing element is that the county's responsibility is to ensure that the zoning is adequate to develop the number of homes that we're required to develop for the regional housing need allocation. But it is really up to the property owner whether they pursue that development. So if a site was rezoned to allow additional homes on it, the property owner could choose or choose not to develop those homes. So it really is at their discretion of whether they would develop any additional homes on the site.
There are a couple comments slash questions here around the number of identified sites. It's hard to believe that there are only 3 identified sites for possible new homes in this area. So there's some questions about that.
So if Jillian, if you want to pull up the list, well, let's come back to this so that you could just pull up that list that we have on the website and we can just make sure that we mention each of them. So why don't we go to the next question and then we'll come back to that and she can answer that, go through each of those sites.
Yeah, next question is, how do the new homes planned for the Fireman's Fund location factor into this plan?
That's a good question. The Fireman's Fund site is within the city of Novato. So the city of Novato would likely use that site as their, so that each city and town, as well as the unincorporated county, has to plan for housing. And they have to do their own housing element in their plan to meet housing at all income levels. And so the city of Novato also has that responsibility. So they would likely use that site, maybe one of the sites that they use for their housing element.
I have the list. I can just pull it up. And I also put a link in the chat to the list if anyone wants to peruse it. So It looks like we have all of these sites in the Atherton corridor, 2 sites in Black Point. Just going through.
And you'll see all these other sites that she's listing are other sites throughout the different parts of the county. So you can see there Marinwood and Nicasio, and then here's North Novato.
North Novato. We have some in West Marin and Olima Point Reyes Station, Santa Venetia, so unincorporated San Rafael, unincorporated Mill Valley. I think that's it
Mollis,
for
right.
That's it for Novato, but this is a great tool that I put in the chat if you want to look up by your neighborhood, whether that's North Novato or Atherton, or another area of the county is so.
Yes, I think it's also notable that there's sites proposed really in all areas of the county at this point, but they have not been selected. They are being studied at this point. There isn't a recommendation out yet. Let's go to the next question.
Next question is, are any of the sites in the Atherton corridor owned by the county, or are they owned by private properties? So eminent domain will need to be exercised for acquisition.
This is an interesting question that came up last night also. So they are all privately owned. No eminent domain is part of the housing element. That is not a proposed policy. And what eminent domain is, for those who may not know, is that if sometimes a government entity will acquire property. For example, if they need to expand the road or they needed to do some infrastructure improvements, and they needed somebody's property to do that, then they could acquire it at market value, and that's called eminent domain, regardless of whether the property owner wanted to sell it. That is not on the table. It's not part of the housing element. There's no eminent domain. So what the county would do is they would rezone a site, and if the owner decided that they wanted to develop additional housing, they would have that option. There would be no requirement. So if there was a site that was zoned that had a single family home on it, the county selected it in the housing element, rezoned it at a higher density, the property owner could opt not to develop it at that density. They could just leave it as is. So that would be on the table as an option.
Next question is, excuse me, are any of the housing developments currently being built going towards the renegel?
Good question. So if a property has received its planning and built, if it's received either as planning or building entitlements, but it hasn't yet been constructed, then we can count it towards our housing element as a credit site. But if it, in those cases, we can count them towards. I'm trying to think of a good example of a site, but not one coming to the front of my mind right now. I don't think that we have any in this area that are credit sites. But if so, then we can count that towards, and then it reduces the total number of units that we have to plan for. So if we had a housing development that was proposed for 100 units, we don't. But if we did, then we could take 100 units off of our total RHNA that we needed to plan for.
So then here, 3,569 new homes. What does that mean in terms of bedrooms and bathrooms? And then also, are trailer park mobile home sites included in any of the prospective sites?
So the number of bedrooms and that level of detail isn't something that we plan for. We have to show that we have enough housing, enough sites that can accommodate that total number of housing units. There also has to be programs and policies that address, housing that's going to meet our community needs. So we know that we have an aging population in this county. And so ensuring that there is programs and policies that address the need for senior housing and help facilitate that type of housing. For example, we also have a need for family rental housing. We've seen that a lot of our renter households actually have a larger size of family households. And so we need to make sure that our rental housing would accommodate larger families. So there's some of that would be within programs and policies, but actually deciding kind of how many bedrooms and bathrooms, et cetera, on a, or what would actually be developed on the site is more specific. And I think there was a second part of that question that I may have missed.
Yeah, around whether trailer park and mobile home sites are included into the prospective sites.
Yeah, so if there's an existing a mobile home park, then we would not propose rezoning that. But if, but that is a tool that could be used as housing in our community, but we don't have any proposal to rezone existing mobile home parks. There's a goal to preserve that as housing type that, it serves lower income folks typically. So that is not, we don't want to rezone those sites and change that use. We don't have any, sites that we're proposing to zone specifically for mobile home parks, but it is a tool that can be used for serving housing needs in our communities.
Next question is, who will own the new homes? Will they be owned by the occupants, or will they be low income occupants as tenants?
So it's important to remember that the county, our job is really to set the table for development. We have to provide sites that are zoned appropriately to accommodate the new homes. We have to look at what constraints there are to development and ensure that that those homes could develop, but we don't build the housing. So if a developer came along and was proposing to develop on one of those housing sites, they could propose either rental housing or ownership housing, and it would really be up to the property owner and a developer about what that housing would look like. If it's affordable housing and they're working with the county and they were seeking funding from the county or fee waivers, then there is some affordability guarantees. We require long-term affordability. We would also restrict the rents based on kind of what the funding mechanism was for those homes, and that could either be rental or ownership. In Novato, there's it's in the city of Novato, but Habitat for Humanity, for example, is developing a home ownership development there across the freeway, and they're looking at serving lower income households with a home ownership model. So there's different types of affordable housing, both ownership and rental.
There's a question here around, if an area receives a large amount of negative feedback in the Balancing Act tool, will that area be taken off the rezone list?
We will share that feedback with the board and the planning commission. We've received feedback about most of our sites with concerns ranging from concerns around flooding, concerns around traffic, concerns around fire hazards. So those are some of the examples of what we've heard, and we'll be sharing all of that information so that the board and the planning commission have all of the feedback that we've heard from the communities that we've visited.
For this
And
question,
I'm sorry, I just want to note that I did not directly answer, because we're what we'll have to show is like, here's all the feedback we received. And I can't know, if we have negative feedback about all of our sites, we're still going to have to, the board is still going to have to find some of those sites, and in order to get a certified housing element, because there's repercussions if we don't. So I can't say, if there's a bunch of negative feedback, yes, we will, or no, it won't be taken off, because it really depends on what happens around the whole county, because some of the sites are going to have to be selected. So I just want to make sure that I'm not dodging it. There just isn't a clear answer at this point. Sorry.
Thanks for clarifying, Lily. And maybe Jillian, you can answer this next one too. Regarding Balancing Act, what if you just want to comment on Novato? How do you reduce the number of units to balance? And is the city of Novato on the same schedule for adoption?
Okay, I can answer both of those questions. So for Balancing Act, yes, you can make comments only on the sites in Novato. If you don't think any of the sites in Novato are adequate, you can actually take them all off of the Balancing Act website and put them in other areas of the county. You can also email us about sites, but yes, if you there's that little comment box next to the sites in Novato. But if you find that one of the sites in Novato isn't in Balancing Act, you can use any of the other tools we described. There was the other question about Novato's timeline. So you bring up a good point that I want to reiterate. So not only are we doing our housing element, but all of the jurisdictions in Marin County are in the same timeline, including Novato. You know, I can't speak for them, but I know that they have started their housing element just like all of the other jurisdictions, and I'm sure that that you will be hearing from them soon.
I understand that they'll have their website up. If it's not up now, it'll be up shortly within a week or so, that they'll have more information on the City of Novato's website about their housing element update.
Next question is, what is the next major step in this process to confirm or deny planned building locations?
So at this point, this is our last scheduled community meeting. We've been going around the county throughout the month of February. We will now be compiling all of the information that we've received through all of the different ways of providing feedback. And we'll be going to the board and planning commission in March. We have 2 meetings scheduled in March, the 1st and the 15th. Both of those meetings will be remote like this, just given the number of people that we're anticipating will be there. And we'll be presenting the board with an overview about the community outreach that we've done and what we've heard, and making and providing them with a couple of different scenarios, alternatives for sites, which reflect and include the feedback that we've heard.
Next question is, how do you ensure that children who live in the new housing have access to neighborhood schools? Is that part of your consideration?
So if a family development is proposed in a site, then they would work with that school district. I believe it's my understanding that there's California law that says if there's families that live in that school district, that the school needs to serve them, and they either have to accommodate them through additional classrooms or teachers or et cetera, but that the school works with that development and those children that are there. I would say that when we're thinking about the county's new requirement around affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a long way of a wordy way of saying our fair housing requirements that are now required by the state, that one of the things that we need to do is ensure that we are providing housing for families and children in areas of opportunity. So just those type of things that you're talking about, where there's access to good schools, there's access to parks and other services. So that's one of the goals that we now will be working on in the new housing element process.
Will this plan result in a change of zoning rules? How would upzoning of larger lots work? Could someone build 20 units between 2 single-family homes?
So yes, the analysis that we've done is that when we looked at all of those different income categories that we had, we found that we primarily had enough, our zoning was adequate to meet those above moderate income categories, and really where the shortage was in the lower and moderate income housing. So that's where we will have to rezone or and change our policies in order to accommodate more lower and moderate income housing. So there will be changes to it. Exactly kind of how that process would work for larger properties. Typically we'll go through an environmental review process for it. Any environmental hazards or other issues would be identified through that process, and then there would be hearings in front of the board and planning commission to do those rezones. I think there was a question about whether you could develop between two single homes. And I don't think that we have sites that are exactly like that, but I think I wouldn't be able to answer that without looking kind of more specifically at a specific site. But in general, we have, maybe Jillian can talk about the multifamily design guidelines that we're working on and kind of how that would fit within our development and how that would kind of inform any developments, if you want to talk about that a minute.
Yeah, sure. So we have objective design and development standards that we're in the process of refining, and those will be brought to the Planning Commission and the board. And those objective design standards focus on place types and housing types that fit with the architecture or form of a community. So, you know, some of those house types might look like a single family home, but have 4 units in them, and also can provide adequate parking on site. So one of the reasons why we're doing objective design and development standards is because we found that the state is taking away local control over the design and physical form on our sites. And one of the ways that we can achieve that is through objective design and development standards that specify where parking is located, what the side setback would look like, how something like an apartment building would transition to a single family home. So it's not just this, you know, huge building that's being plunked in the middle of 2 single family homes. It's really about looking at the context, while also making sure that we achieve the number of units that are needed per state law or zoning code. So that's going to be a really great tool for us with the housing element. When we have sites where we know a certain number of units need to be there, we have this toolkit of different building types that won't look outside of what we already see in Marin in terms of architectural style and material.
Thanks, Aline.
Just want to do a quick time check. We're at 5 minutes to 7. We have a lot of questions remaining. I don't think we'll get to all of them, so we'll definitely do a follow-up. But should we go ahead and continue with a few
Let's
more?
continue. I think that we should, given the number of questions, if you guys are okay, we'll stay on for you know, at least till 7:30 if that works. If people need to drop off, just to let you know that we will answer all the questions. If we don't get through to them, we will send out, we have your emails, and we'll respond to the questions that we don't get to, and we'll make sure that those are responded to. But let's continue to make sure that people get their questions answered, and we'll try to make them. Let's all try to be a little more brief so that we can get through people's questions.
Aline,
Great.
before you get to the other questions, I noticed a theme in the chat around scarcity of water, infrastructure. There's a lot of concern about traffic, etc. All of those kind of issues related to traffic, everything from traffic to water resources to school enrollment, are actually going to be reviewed as part of our environmental review process. So once our candidate site list has been narrowed down by the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission, our consultant team is going to do a deep dive and study, you know, what are the biological issues here? What are the transportation issues, and how can all of that be mitigated in order for us to achieve our RENA? Just to talk about water specifically, we're also in consultation with all of the water districts because we understand that drought, you know, is all around us and it's a possibility, and it's, you know, pretty much going to happen in the future as well. But we know that Marin Water is looking at some pretty innovative ways, and one of those ways that I find particularly interesting is that we use potable water. So we use fresh water to water our medians, our golf courses, our high schools, etc. If we use recycled water for those purposes, and Marin Water is exploring that, it could significantly offset our need as it relates to housing and some of our other needs that we have per residential use.
Great, thanks, Jillian. Yeah, agreed, that's a theme, so thank you for addressing that. So there's a question here, I'll read it verbatim. Since someone will sue about something, can they do that once the plan is passed?
I don't think that I can answer that. I'd have to know more about the specifics about what that was looking like. I guess a specific development application could be challenged, although more and more the state laws have, under the Housing Accountability Act, have really limited what that looks like. So I guess that we would just have to know more about that.
The parcel near the Buck Center is an unincorporated Novato. Why is that on the county list?
There's a portion of the site and that's near the Buck Center, and we're calling it the Buck Center site that is actually in the unincorporated part of the county, and that's why that portion of the site is under consideration.
There's a question here for the Atherton corridor. What are the key factors that led to 400 units under the countywide distribution scenario? Why are all the potential sites in the Atherton corridor very low or low income sites for this location? What has led to the determination that there is realistic potential for development?
Okay, there was a lot there. I'll give a general answer. So under the countywide distribution, because most of the northern part of the county is not within the unincorporated county, we looked at where are some development opportunities. And given the proximity to the freeway, given the size of the lots and the relatively small amount of those lots that were developed, that's how Atherton was identified as a possible area that could be rezoned when you're looking at that kind of filling in and focusing on redevelopment and within your existing communities. They were identified for lower income because they met the criteria that the state requires. So it's kind of that's called a unicorn site. It can't be too big, it can't be too small, and it could be zoned at a density that would meet what the state's requirement was. So that is why it is being studied at this point.
Follow up to the Fireman's Fund question. If the city of Novato will build 1,100 new homes there and 512 are slotted potentially for Atherton, does a density issue come into play?
I'm assuming that the density, I'm not sure what that means, but I'm assuming that it means would the impacts of both of those projects be considered? And when we do an environmental review, yes, that both of the impact of the proposed development within the cities and the county and the traffic impacts, et cetera, would also be included in that analysis.
If a property is rezoned at high density, can an owner develop as high-end, high density?
Yes, so the sites it's the density that we establish typically. It's not, and when we designate something for lower income housing, it's really that the zoning is adequate to accommodate lower income housing, but we don't say this is the income that you have to develop at. That's really up to the developer. We do offer some incentives if it is lower income, and to incentivize that type of development. The state also offers additional incentives to encourage and facilitate lower income housing. But yes, if a site is zoned at 20 units an acre, it could be developed with higher income condos. There isn't anything that we don't specify exactly what the income level of the housing. Our goal in the housing element is to show that we have adequate zoning to accommodate all types of housing.
Will the county automatically upzone properties like Bowman Canyon to allow for 300 homes? Current zoning does not allow that many. And will the process be easy?
So these sites are all under consideration. None of them have been designated at this point. So Bowman Canyon, Atherton, et cetera, these other sites that we're considering around the county are all under consideration, and we have not at this point selected which site. So we will make a recommendation to the board and planning commission for their consideration. Then there'll be an environmental review that's done, and in the fall the board would be in the position of adopting the housing element and any associated rezonings that would be required to get to that certified housing element. So that would be the process. There may be some other amendments that would need to happen both to the countywide plan and the development code, and those would likely all happen together at those hearings in front of the Planning Commission and the board in the fall, as we certify the environmental review document and adopt the housing element.
If the property owner sells, can the county do something to make sure that they are a buyer at fair market price?
So if a property owner sold their property and they were in order to develop it, the county wouldn't be involved in that process at all. However, if the property did develop as affordable housing, then there would be a long-term deed restriction on the property to ensure that that housing was affordable over time.
So there's a question here. Since Highway 37 is failing and flooding and closure creates a logjam on Atherton and Olive corridors, how can any development be proposed until the state fixes that route?
So all of those comments and considerations will be factored into the environmental review, and if mitigation is needed, it'll be suggested.
Just reading here, given reduced state funding in schools because of lower enrollment, our poor record and reputation for inequality in the county, the environmental effects of a workforce that's forced to live hours away, this is all welcome news. Would love to see more mixed income and high density housing closer to downtown areas. Can you talk more about redevelopment of those lots to higher density?
All right, I was on mute. So, so one of the scenarios that we've looked at is really just that. You know, there's kind of two aspects of that. So we have one scenario where we're looking at redeveloping areas that have existing housing on them that are, you know, there may be a room for some additional units, and that was one of it, that kind of infill scenario. We've also looked at the scenario of looking at current patterns of segregation in our community. You know, we have a long history of that in our community. We have deed restrictions that prevent homes from being sold to people of color. There's a long history of those kind of segregationist patterns that may be built into our land use. And so those are all things that we'll be looking at through the housing element, through the new requirements to affirmatively further fair housing, really looking at opportunities where families who may have lower incomes can live in those areas of opportunity is also one of the goals that we now need to evaluate in our housing element. And so when there's this conversation around Atherton, I think that is one of the possibilities that was under consideration of adding some additional housing within that community. And I think that's an example that the questioner was asking about.
There is a question here. Have you directly contacted homeowners whose properties have been identified on the draft list? And if not, why?
So the candidate list they have not been identified. They haven't been selected. And at this point, we are doing a zoning analysis. If a site is selected for the housing element, a property owner would have no requirement to change the use. But if they are selected and there is a rezoning proposed, then they will be notified through our regular noticing requirement, and that noticing would happen if the site is selected. You know, there's over 150 sites on the candidate list, and to notify everybody at this point before they were selected, it didn't really make sense until we actually get to these sites are selected, and then there would be the noticing, and that would go out through our typical process.
Great. Question here is, when will we know which sites have been selected?
The board has the Board and Planning Commission have 2 workshops scheduled for March, and we'll be considering those site lists. The final site they'll be making, and staff will be making a recommendation at those meetings, the 1st and the 15th. And then a draft list will be selected for further study in the environmental review, and the board won't be adopting and a housing element with a list until the fall of this year.
I just want to note very quickly that our interpreter needs to log off in about 2 minutes. So
Do we have anybody who's using interpretation before we know that we have to stop the meeting?
Miguel, can you ask folks to raise their hand if they're,
If you want, while he's doing that,
yeah, I'll
Just
just move
cue
on
yourself.
very quickly to
Yeah.
the next question, which is very direct around whether emails received at the housing element email inbox will be considered official comments that'll be considered along with the comments received in the Balancing Act tool, and whether there will be a summary of the comments provided to the Board of Supervisors and Planning Commission.
yes to both of those.
Let's see.
Let's go back to, while you're queuing up, let's ask Miguel if there's anybody who is using the Spanish interpretation.
Does not seem so.
Okay, so we can continue after he leaves. Sorry.
Is there incentive or financial support mechanisms for property owners to develop affordable housing? And does this apply to smaller developments like under 10 units?
Yes, the county has a number of funding sources available, including a housing trust fund. There's also federal funds that we get an allocation of through the Community Development Block Grant and home funds. So there are funding sources available. The county also waives fees for affordable deed restricted housing and helps to expedite, facilitate the review of those projects. So yes.
Right. There was a question again around traffic, but specifically whether there have been any traffic studies done to determine if a site can support that level of traffic. Maybe Jillian, if you want to touch on this.
Yeah. So as part of the environmental review, our candidate housing sites will have the corresponding units that the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission ultimately decide on. So, each of the housing sites will be assigned those units, and those units and the traffic associated with those units will be taken into account for the environmental review to see if there are any significant impacts on traffic, and if so, what mitigation measures are necessary.
Great. Question here, current zoning along Atherton has been upwards of 1 acre per home. Is there some consideration about the magnitude of upzoning needed in order to build as many as 50 units in this type of large acre lot sizes?
Yes, that's taken into consideration.
I think. So here, why are new privately mobile home parks not being considered to provide housing?
I think that there just wasn't any sites that it felt like they were adequate for it. That's a good question. And I think that I need to get back to that person. If you can just make note of who that was, we'll make sure that we get back to that. It's a good question, and I need to look into that more. I know that we have a number of mobile home parks throughout the unincorporated county, and they're a really good source. They're a way that somebody can own their own home, and it does reduce housing costs. So that's a good question that I'll need to look into.
There's actually
If there are any sites that, sorry to interject, but if there are any sites that you think would be suitable for mobile homes, then I encourage you to email us or put it on the site suggestion map.
There was a question earlier on that I didn't address. I felt it was a little bit specific, but since we have time now, fire escape routes for Greenpoint exit onto Atherton and Olive. Also, wetlands in the area are a good barrier against fire spread. Audubon killed the set of solar panels in the wetlands. How are you going to get approvals for houses in that area given these considerations?
So all of those considerations are being taken into account during the environmental review process. If sites are chosen in the Black Point area, the environmental review consultants are looking at everything from our biological resources, so are there endangered species there, et cetera, to traffic, to fire escape routes. And we know that that's a big issue in the county right now. Another thing I encourage you, if you are really concerned about those sites in Black Point or anywhere in the county, I really encourage you to use Balancing Act or one of our other tools that we have, because one of the scenarios is to really put the importance of environmental hazards as kind of your first priority. So I encourage you to choose that scenario to see, especially because the environmental hazards in your area. I myself live on a one way in, one way out street in Fairfax, and it's a common occurrence throughout the county, but there are ways that we can mitigate it. But also, if environmental hazards are something that are of great value to you, then I would encourage you to explore that in Balancing Act.
It sounded like that question, or also was wondering about if that site was proposed, whether, how the county would ensure that a development could actually happen on it if there was opposition to it. So one thing to note is that there is some certain protections under the Housing Accountability Act. One of the things that the state has done is they've said, and this is really kind of part of all the legislation that we're looking at, is that housing is it's of a statewide interest. And so if a project is proposed that is consistent with the housing element, then it really is, there's increased certainty for the developer to be able to develop at that density if they propose a project that is consistent with the housing element. So I think that might help answer that question about how the county would help facilitate the development.
Question here as a follow-up around notifying homeowners on the draft list. Just the person is wondering whether we basically said there was no intention to warn them that they're under consideration, but only after they're selected.
So again, if a site is selected, it provides an option for that property owner. It isn't a requirement. So if you have a site that allows 5 homes currently, and it was rezoned to allow 25, you could still just develop 5 homes on it, right? So it just increases the total number that you could have developed on that site, but it doesn't require you to develop at that. So it gives some additional options for the property owner. So if a site is selected, there'll be noticing that goes out. But again, a property owner wouldn't have to change the existing use of their property if it was a religious institution, for example, and we rezoned it to allow additional housing on the site in an underutilized parking lot, for example. That religious institution would have no obligation to develop. They could just say, that's nice, we're going to continue with the existing use as a parking lot and underutilized. So
this question was brought up again. I think we addressed it earlier, and we might have addressed part of it by pulling it up on the list, but we were going to address why it's hard to believe that there are only 3 identified sites for possible new homes. I believe this is in relation to the Atherton area.
Oh, I think there's more than 3, because throughout the unincorporated portion, I mean, Jillian can go through that list and give a quick number and maybe just drop it into the chat, but there's more than 3. And there are sites, as we said, there's 150 total sites that we're looking at throughout the whole county, in all areas of the county. And there's more than 3, and she can drop that number in the chat. We'll go on to the next question.
That was the last question, and the person who asked that question is clarifying that saying that there are only 3 sites in Novato. So we'll drop a list again, Jillian, in the chat so that folks can take a look at that to see all of the sites in the various parts of Novato, including Atherton, North Novato, and Black Point, Green Point, and etc. And then there's a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, there's approximately 24 sites. I'm going to drop the link to the site list. We have the site list total, but we also have site list by geography. I'll drop the site list by geography in the chat.
Great. And then there's just a final question I'm seeing here of whether we can provide a copy of the presentation. And yes, all of this information along with the recording will be made available on our website. And we'll also email this group with a follow-up to any unanswered questions. I think particularly the mobile home question, there were some folks that were interested in that. And any others, we'll review the questions.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Aline, and thanks, Jillian. So thank you, everybody, for being here. We appreciate your comments, your thoughtful questions. We want to make sure that you're aware of the next steps that we have coming up. As Aline said, we'll be posting this presentation, a recording of this meeting on the website. We'll be downloading a copy of the chat to ensure that if there was any questions that we missed, that we'll follow up with the person who asked that. Those questions will also be summarized and included in the comments that we present to the board and the Planning Commission. And we welcome your attendance at those meetings on March 1st and March 5th. They'll be via Zoom and at 5 o'clock in the evening to ensure that anybody who wants to can attend. And there'll be time for you to provide additional comments. If you'd like to, you can send us an email, a voicemail, and what we need right now is to hear from communities about not only what the barriers are to housing in those specific areas, but where they think we should plan for those additional homes that we need to plan for. So we're asking for your help in helping us identify where the appropriate places in our community are to accommodate additional homes to meet our housing obligations. So thank you all. We really appreciate how many people have been here. Again, thank you so much and good night.